Let me tell you something nobody talks about when they describe that place. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the gravity either, though Vorn Station ran about 1.3 standard, enough to make your knees feel like they were filled with wet sand every morning you woke up. It wasn't even the smell, which I still can't find words for in any language I know. Something like burned copper and something else underneath that, something biological, something wrong. No, what nobody talks about is the quiet. Vorn Station 9 was built into the body of an asteroid, a dead rock orbiting a brown dwarf out past the Kelhari expanse. No sun worth mentioning, no warmth. The facility had been carved directly into the stone, tunnel by tunnel, level by level, over the course of what the Vithrani told us was 40 years of continuous excavation. 40 years of drilling and blasting, and pouring their synthetic concrete into cracks in the rock until the whole thing became one solid machine. A prison that was also, in every meaningful sense, a coffin. You could feel the silence pressing against the walls from outside, like the void beyond the rock was trying to get in, and maybe it was. I'd been there 11 months when Marin arrived. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because I think it matters for understanding what actually happened. I did not like Marin at first. Let me just say that outright and not dance around it. When they brought us in, I should say, because it was a group transfer, 12 prisoners from the Aldevex processing hub. I noticed him the way you notice someone who seems like they might become a problem. He was quiet in the wrong way, not scared quiet the way most new arrivals were, not angry quiet either, which was the second most common variety, just still, like he'd already decided something and was waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up. He was human, that much was obvious. Average height by Earth standards, maybe a centimeter or two under my own, with the kind of build that doesn't announce itself. Not broad, not thick, just compact in a way that looked almost unremarkable until you paid attention. Brown skin. Dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything, never settling. His hands, when they processed us through intake, were the thing the Vithrani guards spent the most time looking at. They ran their scanners over his palms twice, then a third time, as if they were expecting the equipment to change its mind. He had scars, not dramatic ones, just the kind of irregular, functional scarring that accumulates on a body that has spent time in situations where the objective was survival rather than comfort. The kind that a military surgeon addresses with the minimum necessary intervention and then moves on. Kale, I told myself that first night, watching him take his bunk in our cell block without a word to anyone. This one will either cause problems or he won't be here long. I was right on both counts. I should explain what Vorn Station 9 was, for anyone reading this who didn't live through it. The official designation was Correctional Penal Facility, Class 7, Galactic Oversight Commission, administered Territory Vithran Kelhari. The Vithrani ran it. That's the important part, the Vithrani. If you've never met a Vithrani, I'll try to describe them without making it sound like something out of a nightmare, though I'll warn you, some details resist softening. They're tall, the shortest I ever saw was close to 2.5 meters, and the command staff ran closer to 3. Bipedal, technically, though the way they moved wasn't bipedal in any way that felt familiar. Their joints worked in additional directions. Their bone structure, as far as any of us could determine from watching them, didn't share much with anything we had words for. Their skin, I hesitate to call it skin, was a dark, iridescent material that shifted color slightly with their emotional state. Calm was a deep violet black. Agitation moved toward green. Real anger, the kind they demonstrated during disciplinary actions, went to a bright, burning copper that hurt to look at directly under the facility lights. And they were almost exclusively female. This was the part that most of the non-Vithrani prisoners found confusing, particularly the ones who'd absorbed their understanding of the galaxy, primarily through trade routes and neutral zone cantinas. The Vithrani social structure was built around female authority at every level, military, administrative, civic. Male Vithrani existed, certainly, but their role in the species' institutional life was, by all available evidence, minimal. The females were the warriors, the administrators, the guards, the engineers. Vorn Station 9 was staffed entirely by Vithrani women. 112 of them, by the count we eventually reconstructed from administrative records. They were, without question, the most physically formidable sentient beings I have ever encountered in a professional capacity. Each of them could, in a straightforward physical confrontation, dismantle a human being in roughly the time it takes to draw a breath. This was not an exaggeration. I watched it happen twice during my first month at Vorn Station 9. Both times it was over before I fully registered it had begun. The human in question, different individuals, different infractions, simply stopped being a threat and started being a medical problem. And the Vithrani guard responsible showed, during the entire process, approximately the same level of visible effort that I might show when opening a difficult jar. They did not see us as threats. This matters. This is the thing that made everything else possible. They saw us, the humans in the prison population, as roughly equivalent to what a livestock farmer might see in a particularly stubborn animal. Mildly inconvenient when uncooperative, not dangerous, not worthy of real concern. They ran Vorn Station 9 the way you might run a very organized kennel, efficiently, mechanically, with the understanding that the occupants would comply because they had no meaningful choice. 11 months I'd been inside those rock walls. 11 months I'd watched the Vithrani move through the corridors in their armor, that dark, form-fitted composite material they wore that had no visible seams and seemed to flex without resistance, and I'd made my peace with the mathematics of the situation. We were animals in a cage. The cage was well made. The cage keepers were very strong and very certain of the arrangement. And then Marin arrived, and within 6 hours of his intake processing, the most senior guard on the floor had already noticed him. Had already started watching him, with something I can only describe as contempt mixed with curiosity. Her name, her designation, the closest approximation in standard galactic common, was Commander Thevraul. And Thevraul made a mistake. The kind of mistake that looks, at the time, exactly like common sense. His intake record, as I later learned from a prisoner who worked in the administrative block, listed him as follows. Species Human Terran. Former designation, Scout Ranger Earth Expeditionary Corps 4th Division Black Site Operations. Offense, destruction of Vithrani Protected Resource Installation, Sector Delvarn 7. Sentence, life imprisonment, no review eligibility. Security classification, low. Low security classification. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man with Black Site operations on his record. A man who had, apparently, destroyed an entire resource installation. We would learn later that installation was a significant understatement. The facility had been a deep-core mining complex with a security garrison of 48 Vithrani soldiers, received a low security classification. The reason, as best we could determine, was that the Vithrani classification system was built around physical threat modeling. Size, mass-known weaponry, combat training on the Vithrani scale, which included things like sustained multi-gravity engagement and chemical resistance protocols and whatnot. By those metrics, a single human of average size with no weapons represented essentially nothing. The system had no meaningful category for what Marin actually was, so it defaulted to the lowest possible rating. He arrived with nothing. Standard intake stripping, any personal items confiscated, any clothing replaced with the facility-issued coverall in the standard mineral gray. He went through processing looking at everything with those quiet, cataloging eyes, and he didn't say a word to any of the guards. He answered the questions they put to him through the translator system in short, direct statements. No attitude, no visible defiance. No fear either, which was unusual enough that I saw one of the junior guards, a tall young Vithrani named Osavith, tilt her head at him for a moment like a bird examining an unfamiliar object. He was assigned to cell Block 12, my block. The first thing he said to anyone, said to me specifically, because I was the human nearest to him when they walked him in, was not hello or how long have you been here or any of the usual opening gambits. He looked at the corridor junction ahead of us, the way the tunnel split into 3 branches, and he said very quietly in English, "Which branch goes below?" I told him the left one led to the maintenance sublevels. He nodded once, just nodded, like I'd confirmed something. The first week, he did nothing unusual. At least, nothing that looked unusual to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. He ate, he slept. He participated in the mandatory work rotations. Vorn Station 9 ran on prisoner labor for its internal maintenance, which was one of the more transparently exploitative aspects of the facility's design, though we had learned not to say so loudly. He moved through the corridors. He completed his assigned tasks. He had no visible altercations with any other prisoners or guards. But he looked at things in a way that made me uncomfortable, and I couldn't initially articulate why. It took me 4 days to understand it. He was looking at everything the way you look at a problem you're planning to solve. Not examining it the way a curious person examines something unfamiliar. Not studying it the way an academic might study a new environment. He was looking at every junction, every corridor, every access panel, every guard rotation, every intake vent, every water recycling station, every illumination fixture with the specific, focused attention of someone who is taking inventory. I've done field work. I know what that attention looks like. I know the difference between a person who is afraid and looking for exits and a person who has already found the exits and is now counting the steps between them. By the end of the first week, I was fairly certain that Marin had counted every step in this facility worth counting. I cornered him in the meal rotation on the 8th day. I want to stress, this was not a friendly conversation in any conventional sense. I approached him because I was scared, and when people are scared, they do things that aren't always well-reasoned. What I said was something like, "Whatever you're planning, stop." He looked at me, those dark, quiet eyes. "I'm not planning anything," he said. "You're looking at everything like you're planning something." A pause. He took a slow spoonful of whatever the facility was serving that cycle. It was gray and it was warm, and it had the nutritional content required to keep prisoners functional, which was the most generous thing you could say about it, and he said, "I'm just learning the building." "Why?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. "Because I've never been in a building that didn't have a way out." I left him alone after that, mostly because I didn't know what to say, and partly because I'd realized somewhere in the 15 seconds of that exchange that I was talking to someone who was operating on a completely different set of assumptions than the rest of us. We had all in our various ways accepted the mathematics of Vorn Station 9. The math that said, Vithrani strong, humans weak, prison inescapable. Marin had not done this calculation. He simply hadn't run the numbers the way we had. Commander Thevra-Ul noticed him on the 9th day. She came through Block 12 on a routine inspection, which at Vorn Station 9 meant she walked the length of the corridor at a pace that could only be described as contemptuous, glancing into cells with the expression of someone checking that their furniture hadn't rearranged itself, and she stopped outside the cell Marin shared with 3 other prisoners. He was sitting on his bunk, looking at the ceiling. Not doing anything, not causing any disruption, just looking at the ceiling. She watched him for about 15 seconds. Then she said something in Vithrani, the primary dialect, the one they used among themselves when they weren't bothering to use the translator, and one of her aides translated it for the general block. The translation went something like, "This one looks like he's thinking. Watch him more carefully." This was, on its face, a routine security precaution. In practice, it meant that Thevra-Ul assigned a guard specifically to observe Marin during non-work hours. The guard's name was Orvanath. She was young by Vithrani standards. I later estimated early adulthood, based on the coloration patterns of her skin. And she was, compared to the senior staff, something approaching casual in her approach to the assignment. Which is to say that she watched Marin with roughly the same relaxed attention a person might give to a moderately interesting documentary. She was not alarmed. None of them were alarmed. That was the mistake. If Thevra-Ul had assigned her best people, her most experienced, her most attentive, and told them to treat Marin as an actual threat rather than an interesting curiosity, things might have gone differently. Not certainly, but possibly. Instead, she assigned a young guard with a loose interpretation of the surveillance brief, which meant that Orvanath watched Marin when she felt like it, and found other things to occupy her attention when she didn't. And what this meant in practice was that she watched him doing nothing for several days, until she stopped expecting him to do anything. Marin, I believe, had anticipated this exactly. The maintenance work rotation was where it started. I wasn't on the same work detail as him. I was assigned to water recycling, which was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds, involving several hours per rotation working with reclamation equipment in a low-ceiling room that smelled like every species in the facility had contributed to the general atmosphere. but I had enough contact with prisoners who shared his detail to piece together what happened. Marin was assigned to atmospheric maintenance, which meant he worked in the deep-level corridors where the facility's environmental control systems ran. These were old systems. Vorn Station 9 had been built before the current generation of V-Thrani atmospheric technology, and the maintenance had been handled for decades by successive generations of prisoner labor, because it was the kind of work the guards found unpleasant enough to delegate entirely. The environmental systems were, in the language of prison infrastructure, critical. They managed air circulation, temperature regulation, and most importantly, the pressure differential systems that kept the facility's interior atmosphere separate from the near-vacuum conditions of the asteroid's surface. They were also, and I cannot stress this enough, old. Old in the way that systems become old when they're maintained by prisoners who have no particular incentive to maintain them well, and inspected by guards who know enough about the systems to know that they're still running, but not enough to know how close to the edge they're running at any given time. Marin worked the atmospheric maintenance rotation for 3 weeks before he did anything visible. In those 3 weeks, what he was actually doing, what we reconstructed afterward from physical evidence and the accounts of the 2 other prisoners who worked alongside him, was learning the systems, not just how they operated. He already knew that within the first few days. He was learning their failure modes, their tolerances, where the load was unevenly distributed. Where a small intervention in one area would create a cascade effect somewhere else. Where the old emergency protocols, built into the hardware decades ago by V-Thrani engineers who were themselves now probably deceased, were still active, but had been overlaid by newer software layers that the hardware would abandon the moment it detected a genuine emergency. He was, in other words, learning how the prison breathed. And then he learned how to make it stop. It happened on a shift rotation, the period equivalent to what we called the early morning hours, when the guard complement was at its lowest, and the prisoners were either sleeping or in early work assignments. The V-Thrani operated on a sleep cycle somewhat longer than humans, roughly 30 hours, which created regular windows where their alertness was at its lowest point, a vulnerability that the facility's designers had compensated for with automated surveillance systems and redundant locking protocols. What the facility's designers had not compensated for was someone who had spent 3 weeks specifically mapping which automated systems fed from which power junctions, and which power junctions shared a primary conduit with the atmospheric regulators. I was asleep when it started. The first thing I knew was the sound. It wasn't an alarm, not immediately. What it was, and this is hard to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it, was a change in the sound the building made. Vorn Station 9 had a constant background noise. The hum of the atmospheric processors, the low vibration of the recycling systems, the faint subsonic rumble of whatever passed for heating in a rock carved out of an asteroid in the dark beyond the Kelhari expanse. You stopped hearing it after a few weeks. It just became the sound of existence, the sound of the place being alive. When it stopped, you noticed immediately, not because it was loud, because it was suddenly, completely, absolutely silent. I came awake all at once, the way you do when your body registers something wrong before your brain catches up. The lighting had changed. The standard blue-white of the facility's illumination had shifted to a dimmer, redder emergency wavelength, which meant the primary power systems had either failed or been interrupted. The locks on our cell block, the standard magnetic locking system, which required continuous power to stay engaged, were in what I later learned was their fail state. They were opened. Not wide open, not invitingly open, just. The magnetic seal was gone, and the physical locking pin had dropped to its default position, which was unlocked, because the V-Thrani engineers who had designed the system 30-odd years ago had, presumably, decided that in a genuine emergency, trapped prisoners were a secondary concern to evacuation. I sat up in the red emergency light and stared at the cell door that had, 60 seconds ago, been the unbreakable boundary of my world. From somewhere in the lower levels, several corridors away, several floors down, there was a sound. Not an explosion, something more controlled than that. More like a series of deep, rhythmic concussions spaced deliberately, each one precisely timed. Like someone who knew exactly where to hit something to make it fall in a specific direction. I want to be clear about what I did next, because I think honesty matters here even when it doesn't reflect particularly well on me. I did not immediately become heroic. I did not seize the opportunity with both hands and charge into the fray. I sat in the emergency light for what felt like a long time, probably 60 seconds, maybe 90, and I processed the information in front of me. And I had what can only be described as a very frank internal conversation about the risk-reward calculations. The risk calculation was Vithrani guards, 3 meters tall, capable of removing me from the situation in a physical sense without meaningful effort. The reward calculation was, I had been in this rock for 11 months. I got up. The corridor outside cell block 12 was empty. This was unusual, even at the lowest staffing hours. There was typically at least one guard making a transit of the corridor every 20 minutes. The red emergency lighting painted everything in a color that made depth perception difficult. The sound from the lower levels continued, rhythmic, deliberate. I moved toward it. I wasn't alone for long. By the time I reached the junction where the main corridor split toward the maintenance sublevels, there were 4 other prisoners moving in the same direction, 3 humans and a Darathi male who'd been in Block 12 almost as long as me. None of us said anything. We just moved. I think we all understood, without articulating it, that something was happening and that whoever was doing it was human, and that we needed to either get clear of it or get close to it, and standing in the corridor undecided was the worst option. The sound led us down. The atmospheric management level was 3 subfloors below the main cell block corridor, accessible by a maintenance shaft that used a ladder system rather than the gravity assist platforms used on the main levels. Under normal conditions, the shaft was locked. Under emergency conditions, with the primary power interrupted, it was not. We went down. The smell hit us first. Not the usual smell of the maintenance level, that mineral dust, machine oil scent that clung to the prisoners who worked down here and never quite came out of the fabric of their coveralls. This was something chemical, sharp and bright and not entirely unpleasant, the way certain industrial solvents have an almost appealing clarity before you register that they're dissolving something important. Then the light, still red, still dim, but down here augmented by several small, self-powered emergency illumination units that someone had clearly placed deliberately, positioned to illuminate specific points of the machinery rather than the corridor in general, like spotlights, like someone had set up a workspace. And then Marand. He was in the center of the atmospheric management chamber, a room the size of a modest gymnasium, filled with equipment I had never had reason to understand in any detail and now desperately wished I did. And he was doing something to the main environmental control hub that I can only describe as surgery. Careful, deliberate, small interventions in a very large system. He had tools, not the standard prisoner work kit, which was deliberately minimal and closely accounted for, but actual tools, the kind with precision and purpose. And I still, to this day, have no completely satisfying answer for where they came from, though the best theory is that they had been inside the maintenance system itself, left by previous prisoners over years, and Marin had found them during his 3 weeks of looking. He didn't look up when we came in, he kept working. "How many of you?" he said. "5, I said. A pause, something clicked inside the hub. A secondary light, not red, but a cool, steady blue, pulsed once deep inside the machinery. "Good," he said. "I need people who can move." This is the part of the account that I have given in various forms to various authorities, and I want to state here, for the record, exactly what he told us, because it was the most terrifying briefing I have ever received. He had, over 3 weeks of maintenance work, mapped the entire infrastructure of Vorn Station 9. He had identified 7 critical nodes in the facility systems: environmental control, primary power distribution, secondary power distribution, atmospheric pressure regulation, communications relay, external docking controls, and emergency beacon array. And he had determined the sequence in which disabling these nodes would create a cascading failure state from which the facility could not recover without a complete external intervention. He had determined that this intervention would take, given the facility's location and the nearest Vithrani administrative hub, a minimum of 14 hours. He had calculated that in those 14 hours, with the facility's containment systems inoperative and its communications array dark, the prisoner population could reach the external docking bay, override the shuttle lock protocols using the administrative codes he had extracted from a terminal in the maintenance level 3 weeks earlier, and depart. He laid all of this out in approximately 4 minutes. Flat, factual, no unnecessary words. Then he said, "The guards are going to figure out what's happening in about 8 minutes. They'll try to restore primary power first because that's the protocol. I've made that difficult but not impossible. The window is tight." "How long do we have?" the Dorathi prisoner asked. Marin's hands kept moving in the hub. "If you start moving the block populations toward the docking level right now," he said, "you have enough time. If you debate this for 3 more minutes, you probably don't." We didn't debate for 3 more minutes. I want to describe, as accurately as I can, what it looked like when 112 Vithrani guards realized what was happening. Because this is the part that doesn't get told correctly when people retell the story later. The story that circulates, the story that became something of a legend on certain frequencies of the unofficial galactic information networks, presents Marin as someone who defeated the guards, as if there was a fight, as if there was some brilliant martial confrontation. That is not what happened. What happened was that the guards never got the chance to fight. By the time Commander Thevraul and her staff understood what was occurring, understood not just that there was a power failure and an emergency state, but that the emergency state was deliberate, was structured, was aimed. By the time they processed the scope of it, the prisoner population was already moving. 231 prisoners, across multiple cell blocks, moving through corridors that should have been locked, guided by the 5 of us who'd been with Marin and were now relaying his instructions through every network of communication we'd built over months and years of inhabiting those tunnels. The guards tried to establish a perimeter. They failed because the perimeter required communication between units, and the communication systems were compromised. They tried to restore primary power. They found that 2 of the 7 critical nodes were inaccessible. Marin had sealed the access panels using the maintenance equipment in a way that required cutting tools the guards kept in a storage area that had, quietly, been locked from the inside with a 300-kilogram equipment unit. They tried to physically intercept the prisoner population. And here is where the mathematics that the Vithrani had always applied to this situation, Vithrani strong, humans weak, ran directly into a different kind of mathematics. A mathematics they had not calculated. 112 guards, 231 prisoners, in corridors that were no longer well lit, no longer locked, no longer running the automated surveillance that would have told the guards where each individual prisoner was at any given moment. In corridors where the environmental systems were cycling through irregular pressure states that made the air feel wrong, that made focus difficult, that made the smooth, certain competence of trained soldiers feel slightly unreliable. I am not saying that the prisoners defeated the guards in any direct sense. What I am saying is that 231 people who know they might be dying if they stop moving through familiar corridors in the dark toward the only exit that matters, are not the same as 231 people in locked cells. The Vithrani were still stronger. They were still faster. In any individual encounter, any single prisoner who faced a single guard was at a significant disadvantage. But individual encounters were not what was happening. What was happening was a flood. I didn't see Marin again for 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, I was with the larger population, helping move people toward the docking level, relaying information through the prisoner communication network that we'd spent months building precisely because we'd always known, in some theoretical way, that it might matter. And what I was doing was practical and urgent and left no room for reflection. But in the 40 minutes that I wasn't with him, Marin was doing something that I only fully understood when I heard other accounts later. He was not running for the exit with everyone else. He was finishing the work. Because the plan was not simply get the prisoners out. Getting the prisoners out without the final sequence would have meant a 14-hour window that the Vithrani would spend organizing a rapid response interdiction that would catch the shuttle, old, slow, designed for administrative transport, not for a 200-person emergency flight, somewhere between the asteroid and the nearest neutral zone way station. The final sequence was the part that made that impossible. I don't know exactly what it involved technically. The accounts I've heard from people who understand atmospheric and structural engineering better than I do suggest it involved directing the facility's own pressure regulation system to perform a controlled process that it was not designed for, using the same knowledge of the system's original fail-state protocols that had opened the cell doors in the first place. Something that the system would do if it believed it was protecting itself from a catastrophic breach, but that in this case would be directed at the facility's own infrastructure rather than any external threat. The practical result was that Vorn Station 9, over the course of approximately 4 hours following our departure, underwent a series of structural failures in its deep levels that rendered the facility unlivable and, ultimately, unrepairable. No one died in those failures. The Vithrani staff evacuated through their own emergency protocols. Marin apparently had ensured the timing was compatible with that. He told me later, in one of the few longer conversations we had during the subsequent months of running, that destroying the facility had been a goal. Harming the guards had never been part of the plan, not out of any abstract mercy, but because unnecessary casualties would have been sloppy. Would have changed the nature of the response, changed the resources the Vithrani would commit to finding us, changed everything. Clean is better, he said. Always, messy victories are just slower defeats. He reached the docking bay 12 minutes before the last shuttle prepared to depart. I know this because I was in the bay. I had gotten there with the first wave, 20, 30 prisoners who'd made the run fast and found the bay exactly as Marin had described. The locking protocols already cycled to open by a system input he'd prepared days in advance. We'd been loading people, doing what we could to manage the organized chaos of 200 humans and a handful of other species piling into a shuttle designed for administrative transport. When Marin walked in, he looked exactly the same as he'd looked on the day of his intake. Same quiet, same still, same dark eyes moving over everything, cataloging. He was carrying something, a small unit, a device I didn't recognize, that he placed with deliberate care in a specific location near the bay's environmental system junction. I didn't ask what it was. Later, I decided it was probably the last piece of the sequence, the thing that ensured the facility's systems received the final input they needed. He looked around the bay. He counted. I watched his eyes move from person to person, and I understood that he was doing exactly that counting, the way he'd counted everything from the day he arrived. Then he said to me, "Who's flying this?" I told him nobody had claimed that yet, which was approximately accurate. "All right," he said. He walked to the cockpit. The shuttle that left Vorn Station 9 in the early hours of what the facility's logs would later record as cycle 14,882 carried 227 prisoners. 4 remained behind, 3 too injured to move, 1 who refused to leave, a choice I still don't entirely understand, but that I've learned over time to respect. It was not a comfortable flight. The shuttle had life support adequate for 40 passengers and cargo, which meant that, for most of the 14 hours before we reached the neutral zone way station at Kelhavren, the air was warm and thick, and there was simply not enough room for everyone to be anywhere other than exactly where they were. People were in the corridors, in the cargo sections, in every space that would hold a body. It was loud and it smelled, and it was, without qualification, the best 14 hours I had experienced in the preceding 11 months. Marin flew the entire way. He had no co-pilot, he didn't ask for one. When we landed at Kelhavren, a neutral commission way station with a population of about 2,000, governed by the kind of loose, pragmatic administrative structure that characterizes places that exist specifically because nobody with strong opinions about anything wants to be there. The station authority came aboard with about 6 officials, and the expression of people who had dealt with unusual situations before but were being tested by this one. Marin spoke to them for about 20 minutes. I don't know exactly what he said. I know what the outcome was. The station accepted us, processed us through their refugee registration system, arranged food and temporary housing, made the appropriate notifications to the relevant neutral zone authorities. I found out later that part of what Marin had told them was that the legal status of everyone aboard the shuttle was, technically, complex, that the Vithrani had certain claims under the Kelhari Treaty provisions, but that he had documentation, which he provided from a data unit he had kept on his person throughout the entire operation, establishing grounds for refugee consideration under Galactic Oversight Commission protocols. Grounds that his 3 weeks in the maintenance levels had apparently also been used to prepare. He had filed for refugee status for all 227 of us before the shuttle had left the docking bay. I was debriefed 4 times by 4 different authorities over the following weeks: the Galactic Oversight Commission, the Neutral Commission, a joint Vithrani neutral oversight body that had been assembled specifically to investigate the Vorn Station 9 incident, and an Earth Expeditionary Corps representative who found me at Kelhavren and asked me, with some urgency, what I could tell them about the man who'd flown the shuttle. I told them everything I've told you here. At the end of the Earth Corps debrief, the representative, a woman named Liaison Commander Harville, who had the specific expression of someone who had been surprised too many times by the same general category of event, and had stopped being surprised, but had never quite managed to stop being unsettled, said something that I've thought about a lot since. She said, did he ever express what he was thinking? What his overall objective was? I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the first conversation, about the building, about every building having a way out. He said he'd never been in a building that didn't have a way out, I told her. She wrote something in her notes. Did he think he'd find one eventually? She asked. A building with no exit. I thought about Marin at the helm of that shuttle, about 11 months of walls and rock and silence, about those cataloging eyes. I don't think he's looked for one, I said. I think he stopped asking whether there was a way out and started asking where it was. There's a difference. She looked at me for a moment, then she closed her notes. Yes, she said. There is. Vorn Station 9 was decommissioned 6 months after the incident. The structural damage was declared irreparable. The Vithrani Administrative Authority submitted a formal complaint to the Galactic Oversight Commission regarding what they termed the willful exploitation of facility vulnerabilities by a human prisoner operating under false behavioral classification. The Commission reviewed the complaint. They also reviewed the documentation Marin had filed regarding conditions at the facility, the labor exploitation, the classification of human prisoners as low security by default regardless of actual profile, the maintenance infrastructure maintained by prisoner labor without compensation or protection. They reviewed the medical records of prisoners who had been at the facility. They reviewed the intake procedures. They reviewed the physical evidence of the cell block conditions. The formal complaint was not acted upon. The facility was not rebuilt. The Vithrani, to my knowledge, have not constructed a prison in the Kelhari expanse since. I saw Marin once more about 8 months after Kelhavren, a transit point, one of the busy neutral zone hubs where different routes cross. He was moving through the crowd and I almost missed him. He had the same quality in public spaces that he'd had at Vorn Station 9, that quality of not announcing himself, of being exactly present but somehow at the edge of attention rather than the center of it. I called his name. He stopped, turned, looked at me with those same quiet eyes. We talked for about 10 minutes, nothing deep. The kind of conversation 2 people have when they share something enormous and cannot find the right scale for it in ordinary words. He told me he was working. He didn't say at what. I didn't ask. When we were about to part ways, I asked him something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since Vorn Station 9. Since that first night in the red emergency light, when I'd come to the edge of a decision I thought might get me killed. I asked him, did you know it would work? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, not for certain. Then why? He looked at me. At the transit hub, the crowd moving around us, every species and configuration of life that the neutral zone had to offer flowing past in that particular way that busy places flow, indifferent and continuous and alive. Because the alternative, he said, was knowing I hadn't tried. The last confirmed record of the facility designation Correctional Penal Facility, Class 7, Galactic Oversight Commission, Administered Territory Vithran Kelhari, VORN Station 9, is a decommission order dated 7 months after cycle 14,882. The order cites irreparable structural compromise of primary operational infrastructure as the cause. In the box where the name of the responsible party should be listed, someone in the Commission's administrative apparatus has written, in the cramped, precise notation of official record-keeping. Cause human. Just that. No name, no inmate number, no scout ranger designation. Just the species. And maybe that's the part the Vithrani administrative system never actually processed. Not the plan, not the execution, not the structural engineering or the system mapping or the refugee documentation filed before the shuttle cleared the docking bay. The part they never processed was simpler than any of that. The part they never processed was a human being sitting in a cell in a rock at the edge of everything, looking at the ceiling with those quiet eyes, and deciding, in the complete silence of a prison that had forgotten what it was holding, that every building has a way out. You just have to be willing to look long enough to find it.